shout out the two other groups that are hosting tonight. Indivisible Minnesota Local, who's behind the camera right now. You want to wave to that? And Stand Up Minnesota, who's also standing right now, Jordan. So thank you to those three groups for sponsoring tonight. We are here, of course, to talk about voting rights in Minnesota, and so I'm very happy and pleased to welcome Steve Simon, Secretary of State.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for being here. I really, really appreciate it. Nothing else is an excuse for me to come back to this building. I haven't been here in a couple of years, and it's just a charming place. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. We've got 20 days left. 20 days to make something very important happen in this community, in this state, and in this country. The stakes are high. I don't need to tell you how high. And in the business I'm in, they are particularly high. So it's a pleasure to be with you as I talk about all these issues. It's great to see some familiar faces and some new faces. I just want to call out one familiar face in particular that many of you, I hope, know, and that I know and admire and respect, and that is State Representative Alice Hausman. So, I was in the legislature for 10 years, representing Hopkins and St. Louis Park, and I served with Alice all 10 of those years, naturally. She was the chair and is now the ranking member of the Capital Investment Committee. But beyond that, she's one of those members that you can say year in and year out, no matter what the session and no matter what the issue. She's one of those relatively few members where when they speak on the floor of the Minnesota House, a hush sort of descends. People want to hear, whether they agree with her or not, people listen when Alice Hausman speaks, and as a result, she's very effective and very respected in the Capitol. So I'm particularly grateful that she's here to listen to what I have to say, at least for a little while, I hope. So the Office of Secretary of State does a lot of things, you may know. By law, we have a lot of responsibilities. For example, every business in Minnesota that starts, has to file with our office and has to do so thereafter every year. So we have a lot of commercial and business activity. We also run a program called the Safe at Home program. Safe at Home is an address confidentiality program for victims of domestic violence, stalking, sexual assault, and so forth. It allows those in the program to keep their home address secret and private for all purposes. It is life-saving work, very gratifying and very important. But it's no surprise to you that the signature responsibility of the office, at least in the mind of the public, has to do with our role as the Chief Elections Administrator, overseeing our election system in Minnesota. And as a result of that work, which was candidly the reason that I ran for this office, I like to say that I'm in the democracy business, and what a time to be in the democracy business, am I right? All three of the sponsors of tonight's event, and thank you, by the way, to all three organizations, all three are very, very concerned, even alarmed, I would say, about the state of our democracy and the potential for things to go wrong in our democracy. And I think that their concern is not unfounded. So in my business, in the democracy business, it's a time to really reflect and to think about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And the good news is that in Minnesota, generally speaking, the democracy business is booming. So we, this year, have released some statistics, and we will continue doing so between now and Election Day, about just what's going on out there. And what's going on out there is, I think, something really big. Now, we won't know for another 20 days, but let me just throw a couple of numbers at you. According to the statistics that our office recently compiled, if you look at new voter registration, not people who have re-registered, who moved from Mankato to St. Paul or from Bemidji to Duluth and had to re-register. No, I'm talking about brand new, fresh people, fresh and new to the voter rolls. If you look at the exact same day, today, versus 4 years ago, the last midterm, the last non-presidential election, that's the best apples-to-apples comparison. We are more than 2 to 1. More than double the number of people. Yes. Not only that, of those new people, of those 2 to 1, compared to 4 years ago, nearly 70% of them are between the ages of 18 and 30, which is a big increase over the same period 4 years ago. So something is going on out there. We had a primary election in August. Many of you, I hope, voted in that contest. It was the largest raw number of voters in a Minnesota primary since at least 1950. It was the largest percentage of voters since 1982. As I say, something is going on out there. And one last statistic. When it comes to absentee balloting, if you look at now versus 4 years ago, we are over 200% above where we were 4 years ago, both in terms of absentee ballots requested and absentee ballots that have been returned and accepted. I'll say it again. Something is going on out there. It's going to culminate in 20 days. We'll see who it benefits and who it doesn't. But people seem fired up to vote. All the indicators is that they are. How that's going to play out, who's to say right now? So as I said, I'm in the democracy business. Business is booming in Minnesota. And it's worth noting and remembering that Minnesota has had a really good record when it comes to voter turnout, voter participation, and civic engagement. Really good. You may not know or remember exactly how good. Let me tell you how good. This good. At one point in our recent history, for 9 elections in a row, Minnesota was #1 in the country in voter turnout. 9 in a row. Just think about that. If you heard about a win streak in any other area like that, if you heard about an athlete who won 9 MVP awards in a row, or an actor or actress who won 9 Oscars in a row, you would be floored, right? Minnesota at one point in our recent history for 9 in a row, #1, until a few years ago. A few years ago, we started to slip just a little bit, not a lot. When I came in 2014, we were #6 in the country in voter turnout. Still solid. And hey, if you're grading on a curve, 6 out of 50, not bad. You would bring that grade home to mom and dad easily, right? No problems. But I thought, we can do better because we have done better. So when I came in 2015, I challenged Minnesota to get back to #1. And we knew to do it, it would take a lot of collaboration, a lot of partnerships. We can't do it in our relatively small office alone. We would have to leverage relationships across the state. And we knew if we had a chance at doing it, we would have to talk to new people in new places, in new ways throughout Minnesota, using a lot of new partners, for-profit, nonprofit, etc. Well, I'll skip ahead to the end. On election night 2016, we got there. We met that goal, and now Minnesota is, once again, back on top. We are #1 in the country again in voter turnout. That's good. In case you're wondering what that means, that was about 74.7% voter turnout. So just a little bit under 3/4 of all eligible voters, not registered, all eligible voters, which is even more impressive. So of everyone in Minnesota who is 18 or older, a resident, a citizen, and not a felon, out of all those people, almost 75% voted. That's extraordinary. Any guesses as to who dead last was? We were first. Who was 50th? Just blurt it out. What do you think?
Alabama.
Poor Alabama. Poor Mississippi. They always get guessed. It's neither of those. The answer is Hawaii. Hawaii is the 50th state. I guess if you live in paradise, right, you got other things to do. I don't know. I'm speculating. I don't know. But they're dead last. So I get asked a lot. Why Minnesota? Why is Minnesota blessed with this high participation? Why is it that year in and year out, we are, if not #1, towards the very top of the list when it comes to voter turnout? I think it's primarily 3 things, and I wanted to share those with you, share a particular concern of mine, and then I want to get your feedback and input and pushback and questions and concerns, okay? So I think it's 3 things that account for our good record. The first one, which Representative Hausman knows a lot about, is laws. Laws on the books. We've got good ones in Minnesota, really good ones. Put down there over the years and over the decades, really, mostly in a bipartisan way, and they are meant to protect and to preserve and expand the right to vote in Minnesota. They are meant to reward and encourage voting. So I would say this. We're in the middle of the baseball playoffs right now, so I hope you'll permit me a baseball analogy. You know that in baseball, one of the key rules, even if you're not a big fan, is the tie goes to the runner, right? If the throw gets to the base right at the moment that the base runner hits the base, exactly that moment, the tie goes to the runner. Well, you might say that in Minnesota over the years, as Representative Hausman knows, because her fingerprints are on some of these laws, the rule in Minnesota has been the tie goes to the voter. What I mean by that is when legislators are weighing competing values on legislation, and election-related legislation in particular, they have tended over the years and decades to say, all things being equal, let's do what makes the thing easier, that affords the most access for the everyday eligible Minnesota voter. Okay? That has been the culture in Minnesota. That has been the sort of unwritten, unspoken rule. And as a result, you see some really good laws in Minnesota. What am I talking about? I'm talking about things like same-day voter registration or election day voter registration. We are still, 44 years later, 1974 was the first election that we had. 44 years later, we're still one of only about 14 states that has it. That's it. In most of the rest of the country, as you may know from experience, or you know people who know from experience, most of the rest of the country, if you aren't registered to vote by mid-October or early October, you're out of luck. That's it. Game over. There is no, oh, I forgot. There is no, oh, I didn't realize that moving from one street in St. Paul to another street in St. Paul meant I had to re-register. Or the dog ate my homework, or whatever it is. There is no excuse. That's it. You are out. In Minnesota, that's not the case. As you may know, in Minnesota, you can roll out of bed that day, go to the polling place, and register and vote, and it is a wonderful thing. That, more than any other reform, has really moved the numbers and moved the needle over the last 4+ decades. Really convenient. And by the way, this is not some niche boutique service that just some sliver of the electorate uses. You know, in the last election, about 350,000 Minnesotans used it. 350,000. This is a very mainstream thing. That's worth noting. Another feature of our laws that's worth bragging about and talking about and valuing is that we have now online voter registration. So you don't have to anymore go to some government office and pick up a form. You can. You don't have to put pen to paper. You can do that, sign somebody's clipboard, whatever. Now you can go to a website. It's mnvotes.org, and you can just simply register right there. And it's very easy. It takes most people 2 or 3 minutes, which is great. And it really has leveraged the power of social media and organizing by social media. Let me just give you a quick story. Going into the 2016 election, the single-day record in Minnesota for registering the most number of voters in a single day was about 6,400. That's good, right? If you were to do that 365 days a year, that's a lot of voters, 6,400. So we then worked in the early fall of 2016. We in our office worked with some partners to get that number up around one organized event. And during one day in September, it got up to about 24,000 in one day. We were able to vote. We were all proud of ourselves for good reason until Facebook came along. Facebook blew all of that out of the water. In one day in mid-October, it has to be just about 2 years to the day from today. It was very close. In one day in mid-October in 2016, Facebook put up a single notification to its users in Minnesota. One, not a series of 3 or 5 or kind of bumping you every couple days, a single one. And after that single notification saying, hey, if you want to know how to register in Minnesota, go to this link, etc., 67,000 people in a 24-hour period. 67,000. That's a lot of clipboards on corners. You cannot duplicate that, realistically, with clipboards on corners. So it has unleashed this power of mass organizing through social media, and it's really amazing. So let me just highlight a third part of our laws that I'm particularly proud of, because this was my bill in the legislature during my last term. And that is, now here's the clunky title. The clunky, unwieldy, but officially correct title is No Excuses Absentee Voting, which I'm trying to retire and replace with something like Vote from Home. So the rule before we had that bill passed, or that law passed, which Representative Hausman voted for, of course, and championed, the rule before that was if you wanted to vote absentee, and some of you know this from personal experience, if you wanted to vote absentee, you had to sign a document which was an oath under penalty of perjury, swearing that you were going to be out of town that day or that you were too sick or disabled to go to the polling place. Well, that wasn't working out too well. You know, it was an honor system anyway. There was a lot of so-called white lying going on. There never were any patrols going around in the neighborhoods checking to see if the Swenson family was really in Florida that week or not, or anything like that. That was not happening. So we in the legislature at the time looked around at one another and said, what are we doing here? Why do we really particularly care if someone wants to vote the day before, the week before, even the month before? As long as there's some rules, guidelines, guardrails, whatever, why not give people the chance to vote earlier than just for one day, at one time, in one place? So we've done that, and it has been wildly popular and successful. Just to put it in perspective, before we passed this law, typically in the general election, about 8% or so would vote absentee, 8%. In 2016, that number was just shy of 23%. 23% almost who voted before Election Day even came around. I predict that over time, maybe this year, but over time, that number is going to climb. And that's going to have a lot of downstream effects, including on politics and campaigns, right? That last-minute mailer, that last-minute TV or radio ad that a candidate might decide to take out so that his or her opponent can't respond because it comes out on Saturday or Sunday. Well, maybe that's not such a hot bet or great investment anymore if some pretty sizable chunk of the electorate has already voted by that last weekend, right? So there are a lot of ways we've got to figure out how that's going to play out. But all I know is people love it. I use the example of my dad. My dad is 84 years old. He's got Parkinson's disease. He does not drive a car. He uses a walker. He loved the freedom and flexibility in 2014, the first year it was offered, of being able to vote from home. There are two ways to vote absentee. One is to actually go to a government building, a city hall, and the like. The other, the better way, I think, is to vote from home and do as my dad did and have the ballot come to you, where you live, so that you can vote in one contest while you're eating breakfast. Put it down for a day or 2 or 3 or 10. Pick it up again when you're folding laundry. Put it down again, and so on and so forth. Do your own research. So my dad loved it. He loved the freedom of it. He even claims that he voted for me. I'll never know, right? Secret ballot, and he kind of talks a big game anyway. But it's not just about guys like my dad. It's about all of us. For any reason, it's nobody's business anymore what our reason or excuse is. We can do it because we want to do it. And Minnesotans, as I say, have flocked to it. So those are some examples. I have to say, under the category of laws, there's so much more that we could do as a state to move the ball forward even more, to afford even more access. I, for example, support pre-registration for high school students. About a dozen states have that. Red states, blue states, all states in between. It means 16-year-olds would be able to sign up, put their names on a list. They would be on a pending status for a year or two, and then boom, on their 18th birthday, they would automatically be in the system. It's worked wonders in those other states and has had an effect on actual turnout. I support automatic voter registration for the rest of us. There are, again, over 10 states over the last few years that have passed that. Automatic voter registration would solve so many issues and address so many lingering problems around voting and democracy. And by the way, in Minnesota, there's less there than meets the eye. You know, a term like automatic voter registration, it sounds sweeping, and it sounds like an upheaval of some kind. But really, there's less there than meets the eye. Minnesota already has a motor voter law, you may know this, so that when you get a driver's license, and when you do other government services, but mostly driver's license, you take the eye-chart test and all of that, and then on the form, if you've ever noticed, there's a box that you can check that says, please use this information to register me to vote. And it's effective if you check a box, so it's a so-called opt-in system. All that automatic voter registration would do is reverse that presumption. Now it would be an opt-out. Same form, same box, same stuff you do after the eye-chart test. Now the box would be, please check here if you don't want to be registered to vote, otherwise we will register you to vote. That's it. So despite the sweeping title, automatic voter registration sounds so radical, it's not really. It's a modification of what we already have. And last, and there are many others, but I think it's high time that we restore voting rights to those who have left prison behind. It makes so much sense. I think it's a civil rights issue. We have between 50 and 60,000 Minnesotans who fall into that category. They are out of prison. They have left prison behind, but they cannot vote because of some other aspect of their status. Maybe they're on probation or they're on supervised release, sometimes for years at a time, 5, 10, 15 years, and then they can't vote. So we should move in the direction of North Dakota and a growing list of states that have a bright line rule, which is if you're in prison for a felony, no, you cannot vote. But the minute you step out, the minute someone or something has deemed you good enough and worthy enough and safe enough to be among the rest of us, to rebuild a life and contribute to society, you should get that fundamental right back. So I'm hoping we can make some progress on that. We're close in the legislature. It has really deep bipartisan support, not token bipartisan support. There are many liberal Democrats and many conservative Republicans who are also for this, sometimes for different reasons, sometimes the same reason. But I think we're really making progress on that in Minnesota. So, as I mentioned, I think laws are consist of one of the reasons that Minnesota has performed so well. I mentioned I thought there were 3. That's just one. The second one, in addition to laws, I think, that accounts for our success is culture. culture. Now, I know that's a loaded word. It is often weaponized in politics these days. Let me tell you what I mean by culture in this context. I mean a habit or a way of doing things. A habit or a way of doing things, and undeniably our habit and way of doing things in Minnesota has been to convey the message that voting is good, elections are meaningful, they are not a joke, they are serious, they are consequential, they have downstream effects, that the people, it matters. You know, people get elected to office, whether it's city council, president of the United States, anything else. And what they do or fail to do when they get into office has real world consequences. That's the message I think all of us get in Minnesota. And it stands to reason that that's one of the reasons why we've done so well. Now, quick story of historical interest, at least to me. When I came into office in 2015, it was the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. I think most historians would say it's on the top 10 list of laws ever to pass Congress in the history of this country. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, hard to believe, but at the time it was controversial. Right now it would be 100% to 0 vote in this room, right? The law said to states, you still get to be in charge of elections. However, there's some things you just cannot do. No more poll taxes. No more literacy tests to vote. No more so-called character tests to vote. Because we know damn well why those things were used and who they were trying to shut out. Successfully, I might add. And so Congress stepped in and said, no, you can't do that anymore. And it was controversial at the time. Add to that, and here's the local angle, the Minnesota angle, add to that the fact that Minnesota's U.S. House delegation in 1965 was split evenly. 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans represented Minnesota in the U.S. House. And those 8 people were at each other's throats on a lot of issues. The escalation in Vietnam, the proposed Medicare and Medicaid programs, or a government document. She preferred those words to be in her native tongue. Any of us would. Any of us would. I know that from growing up with her. So I don't speak a word of Mandarin Chinese, but if I did and I worked for a Minnesota company, I was in Shanghai for 2 years, I would want that kind of stuff in English. I just know I would. I just know that. Secondly, and this tends to be an argument winner, and I would argue an argument ender, when you tell people, look, we have been doing some version of this in Minnesota for elections since 1896. I didn't bring here, I should have, the yellowed original copies, which I have, from the Minnesota Historical Society. Starting in 1896 in Minnesota, we were printing voting materials in Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish, German, French, Slovenian, Italian, and on and on and on and on. Now, 122 years later, we're printing them in different languages. None of the languages I just mentioned are on the list. Different languages are on the list, but that's the only way to distinguish what we're doing. We have an unbroken 22-year chain of doing this. And that's a very important thing to push back on, because sometimes we've all encountered, I would imagine, this subtle narrative that somehow we're bending over backwards for this wave of immigrants, and we never ever did that before. And that when my great-grandparents came from Lithuania, for example, you know, they got off the boat, and if they didn't learn English, they were in big trouble, and no one bent over backwards for them. Look, I can't speak about any other state, and I can't speak about any other area. But when it comes to Minnesota and elections, that narrative is false. 122 years, you tell people if you get pushback. 122 years we have been doing the exact same thing. The only difference is the type and the number of languages. So that's one thing that we targeted. Another cultural element for us was targeting young people. Now, no big shocker, young people in Minnesota, as in every other place that I'm aware of in this country, they vote at lower rates than the rest of us. That's just something that's an accepted fact, but we don't have to accept it forever. So we did a couple things that were new, brand new. We started something called Minnesota Ballot Poll, which was a competition among colleges and universities to register students. We had 68 institutions, 2-year, 4-year, public, private, where we had such competitions. It really took off. It was a lot of fun, and it induced a lot of people to register and to vote. But we decided, hey, why stop there? Why not get good habits started even earlier in high school? Even though only some percentage of seniors typically are eligible to vote, all the studies show that if you can get young people thinking about themselves as voters before they actually are voters, that they're far more likely to vote that first time they're eligible. And if they vote the first time they're eligible, they're far more likely to make it a lifelong habit. So what did we do? We started the first ever statewide mock election for high school students. So we went to the high schools, and yeah, there were a few high schools that did a mock election school-wide, not that many, but we wanted to weave them all together. So the idea was we would provide the ballots, we'd keep it real simple, just to the presidency. This year it's just the governorship, just one contest, not every. And we would send out the ballots for free, and the I voted stickers, and the posters, and everything else. They would conduct the election any way they want, report the numbers to us. We then post them on our website so that kids in St. Paul can see how kids in St. Peter or Bemidji or anywhere else voted. And so we decided, all right, this is new, this is fresh. Let's try it out. Let's shoot for 100 high schools. That sounds reasonable. It's a nice round number. It's memorable. It's triple digits. Let's shoot for 100 Minnesota high schools this first time around in 2016. We didn't get 100 high schools. We got 281 high schools, 96,000 students. This year, we're at 130,000 students, and we're going to keep it to the governor's race. So those are seeds that we're planted 2 years ago, planting this year, which we hope will bear fruit in the future with actual real votes. We'll see, right? But we wanted to get started early. And we even did one other thing when it came to younger people. We even experimented with the language that we use when it comes to talking about voting. There were studies out there showing that we got our hands on that said that for young people in particular, but really people of all ages, that if you talk about voting a little bit different, if you talk about voting not just in terms of doing something, like go vote, you should vote, please vote, but if you talk about it in terms of being something, like be a voter, that can actually move the needle, particularly among young people, but really people of all ages. So it's not just doing something, it's being something, or being a part of something. So I remember when we were formulating this plan for 2016, talking to a friend of mine, happening to mention to him all that we were looking at and what we were planning, and he broke into a big grin, and he said, I'm having a light bulb moment here. Being something, not doing something. He said, this is great. I have a teenage daughter at home. From now on, I'm going to tell her, be a laundry folder. No word on whether that has worked for him, but you can try this at home with friends, family, co-workers, be something, not do something. But so we did that. And those are little things we can do to affect the culture. And again, there are more things we can do in future years to affect the culture, not just among those two targeted groups, but really for everyone. And I'm looking for your ideas as well about how we do that. Okay, so I mentioned that there were three things. Laws is one, culture is another. Let me focus on the third and final one, which is confidence. Confidence. People in Minnesota tend to have real, justifiable confidence in our election system. That's not to say there aren't reforms that could be done, or changes that could be made, or holes that could be plugged, but in Minnesota, most people know and understand at a very basic level that our elections are honest, they are not political, they are administered smoothly and honestly in a decentralized way, by the way. So my office, we don't count a single vote, not one. We post what others count, but we don't count the votes. We don't own a single piece of elections equipment, not one. That all happens in counties and cities and townships across Minnesota. 4,100 polling places. We've got 32,000 election judges to put on an election in this state. That's a small army. Has anyone here ever been an election judge? Ever? Thank you, thank you, thank you. We could not do this without you. It's a long day. You're not doing it for your health or to get rich, even though there is a stipend. You're doing it for other reasons, and thank you for that. So people understand that it's a fundamentally honest system, and it just stands to reason. Why would people participate in such high rates over the years if they thought it was just riddled with corruption and wrongdoing? I mean, they know that's not true. This system is administered on the front lines by county auditors, city clerks, and others. They're not putting their thumb on the scale for a political party or a candidate. People get that. They understand that. But there are some threats to that confidence. No question about it. And I know that the three groups who have sponsored this event, and all of you are in touch with some of those threats. We don't have time to discuss them all, but let me just pluck one out that I'm particularly concerned about because it's ripped from the headlines. I believe that the number one threat to the integrity of our elections in this country and in this state is the danger of some sort of attack, a cyber attack, from some outside entity seeking to undermine our democracy and to disrupt our elections. That is the number one challenge. I get asked all the time whether it's family, friends, people I bump into on the street. They'll ask me, hey, Steve, good to see you. You've been in the job now 3+ years. What's your biggest surprise? What has surprised you the most about the office? And I always say the same thing. My #1 surprise in this office has been the extent to which my time and effort and energy and that of senior staff in my office is devoted to this issue. When I ran just 4 years ago for this office, I didn't get one question about this subject from a newspaper editorial board, from an interest group. I don't even think from a voter. Even though cybersecurity as a thing has been out there, 2016 really changed all that. So now it is a central part of the job, my job and the job generally, for me or whoever follows me, whenever they follow me. It's a big, big deal. Now, the good news is, in my opinion, the glass is half full for a number of reasons. #1, Minnesota is a paper ballot state. Remember that. You know this from your own experience. There are states in this country, about 14 of them yet, that have touch-screen voting machines with no paper trail, no receipt. Okay? We expect better from our ATMs when we go get cash. At least it spits out a receipt. Here, nothing in those states. But in Minnesota, good old-fashioned paper. It's one of those great examples of low-tech beating high-tech. Good old-fashioned paper. We are proudly old school. You just fill in that oval with a pen, and it's any old pen. It's a big pen from Walgreens or Target, right? That's it. And yes, it's true that ultimately that ballot will be fed into a machine. That is true. But under state law, that machine cannot, shall not, and must not be connected to the internet. Then there's an encrypted system, as it's called, by which results are reported on election night. Then there are post-election audits by counties, post-election review by our office, and then, under federal law, we got to keep those ballots for nearly 2 years. The paper, the actual paper you can touch and feel and see. So if the media or a political party or anyone has a bad feeling or a suspicion or a hunch, you can take a look at those ballots under certain circumstances. So that's what we've got really going for us in Minnesota. So I'm not as concerned about what might happen in a polling place. It's a very low probability. I'm more concerned about the centralized functions that we run through our office, through the Office of Secretary of State. So let me just tell you what happened in 2016. Not with us, but generally speaking. And I bounced this analogy off of the Department of Homeland Security and others, and they have blessed it. So here's really what happened, the way to think about it, which is that picture a car thief casing a parking lot. Okay? Maybe he goes there a day or two in a row, he brings some binoculars, he's observing traffic patterns, who's coming, who's going, who's watching. In our case, what federal intelligence officials have told me, personally, to my face, and in group briefings that we've gotten, all the secretaries of state, is, in essence, that car thieves were casing your parking lot. We know who they are, we know who they work for, and we know the purpose for which they were trying to enter. And all that is in the public domain, and you know who it is. And fortunately in Minnesota, though, they didn't go into the parking lot. They didn't go in. We think part of the reason for that, at least part of the reason, is some of the cyber defenses that we worked very hard to put up. But we'll never know the full reason with 100% certainty. But they didn't go in. Now, in 19 of the 21 states that were targeted by the Russian government, they had the same result. No one was able to get in or did go in. But in 2 of those states, in Illinois and in Arizona, they did get in. And if I can extend the analogy, I would say in both of those examples, they got into the parking lot and into the car. And in the case of Illinois, I would say they started the engine. 60 Minutes, the news program, they did a segment on this a few months ago. It's really pretty chilling stuff. They sat undetected for weeks, and they were able to basically root around in the records. So what they got into was not at the polling place. It was the centralized feature that I discussed. We call it the statewide voter registration system in Minnesota. It's a multi-million-dollar database, very expensive to build, very expensive to maintain and to keep modern and up to date. And it is the spine of the system. It does more than just track voter registrations, despite its name. It really performs a very important function. It's got very personal and private data in there as well. And so that's where the vulnerability probably is. And we've spent an extraordinary amount of time and attention and resources on making sure that things are good. This is a race without a finish line. This really is. You've got to stay one step ahead of the bad guys all the time. And there is no tape that you cross or end zone where you spike the football. You just have to stay ahead all the time. And that's no different in the Office of Secretary of State than it is for any government office or any private sector office. Target, U.S. Bank, whatever. Any large institution, you've got to stay ahead of these folks. And when the bad guys are funded by deep-pocketed foreign governments, That's a big issue. They're sophisticated. This is not the hobbyists down the block in the basement anymore. These are sophisticated actors with a lot of resources, and so we've got to stay on top of it. I think we have. We've had a great working relationship with intelligence authorities at the federal level. I want to give them credit. They deserve it. They've been a good partner for us. They've come into our office. They've done things remotely. They've provided us with expertise, with intelligence briefings. And so I feel that we're in a very, very good place. But we know that this is going to be a challenge into the future. So that's the number one challenge. I think we just have to stay on top of it. And there's a role to play for a lot of different people. Let me just end with this on that issue. So as a demonstration of how people are starting to understand this issue and get it and act on it, Congress this last spring appropriated a bunch of money to the states for election security of exactly this kind. Minnesota's share of that money was $6.6 million. But there was a catch. The catch is that Minnesota is one of 5 or 6 states that has a special law in place that says when this kind of money comes down the pike, we can't just take it from the federal government. We have to get legislative permission at the state level. Even though it's federal money, the state legislature has to bless it. They have to say, if it's 2 sentences, you are able to spend this federal money. So rather than getting the $6.6 million, we needed a couple of sentences of language from the Minnesota legislature to get that done. Nobody opposed it. Nobody opposed it. Obviously, why would you oppose free money to do something that everyone agrees needs to be done? Now, in legislative speak, as Representative Hausman knows, they refer to bills as vehicles sometimes. And I think it's an apt analogy. If you want to get from point A, which is a good idea in someone's head, to point B, which is enactment into law, you need a vehicle. You need something that's moving from point A to point B. It can be an aircraft carrier, a car, a truck, a carrier pigeon, a helicopter, whatever. It doesn't matter. A vehicle, something that's going to get from here across to point B in enactment. And what I said to legislative leaders was, hey, here's 2 sentences. I don't care how you get across the finish line. Put it on whatever vehicle you want. Motorcycle, moped, scooter, whatever. Just do me one favor. Just one. Please don't put it on the Titanic. Please don't put it on the Titanic. You can use any vehicle you want. Speedboat, canoe, rowboat, hovercraft, whatever. Any vehicle you want to get from here to there. Everyone agrees with this. Just don't put it on the one vehicle. Don't put it on the Titanic. The Titanic was a big so-called omnibus bill. The governor had written letter after letter after letter saying, I think it was 117 reasons, Alice, or 112, over 100 reasons why he said, if you send this to my desk, I'm going to veto it. Now, whether he was right or wrong, or you agreed with all 112 or none, that's not the point. The point is the governor warned in advance this big hulking omnibus bill, I'm going to veto it. That's the Titanic. I said, please don't put it on the Titanic. Choose any other vehicle you want. Guess what they did? They put it on the Titanic. With the predictable result. The Titanic went down, and where it now lies in the bottom of the ocean. And so we are the only state in the country of 50 states that did not get its money in time for the 2018 election. I and we could have used that money. To get a head start on some really important cybersecurity projects. Now, don't get me wrong, I feel good about where we are. I feel good about where we are for the next 20 days. But I would have felt even better standing here today had I had some of that money to work with before the election. I'm confident we're going to get it next session. I'm sure Representative Hausman and others will help to make sure that that happens. But for now, we don't have that money. And that's a shame. And that's a horrible example of politics getting in the way of the public good. And I hope we don't have a repeat of that again because we need that money. We really do. It's in everybody's interest, whether you're Democrat, Republican, or none of the above, that we get that money or some piece of that money. So we're in the process of working on that, and I feel good. And I do feel good about where we are. Can I stand here and tell you there's a 0% chance that anything bad will happen on election day? No, I cannot. And nobody who's responsible in my position or in the position at any of the organizations I mentioned, Target, Best Buy, U.S. Bank, nor could they look you in the eye and honestly tell you it's 0%. It's not 0%. But it is a very low probability, I believe, because we've taken a lot of steps to minimize the risks over the last few years. So I feel good about where we are. Let me just end with this one last thing. I've given you 3 reasons why I think that Minnesota does well. But I understand, as do all of you, that you can pass all the laws you want. You can have as healthy a culture as you want. You can have a high degree of confidence as you want. But there are some people who just will not be moved. There are some people who don't vote, not because they don't know the rules, or they don't see the culture around them, or don't have confidence in the underlying nuts and bolts of the system. They don't vote because they are disillusioned or disgusted with the way politics is practiced, with campaigns, with politicians, with you name it. A particular issue, something that's getting done, something that's not getting done. We've all encountered people like that in our lives. They just don't want to show up. In fact, some of them, it's not just that they don't want to show up. They believe that not showing up is in itself a statement that they need to make. That they are striking a blow for a cause by not showing up. Because that is a way to register their disapproval or their disillusionment or their disgust, is by taking that act and consciously not showing up to vote. I get that. I get that impulse. We have all felt it, even if just for a second. Even I felt it, okay? Where you want to throw your hands up and say, wake me when it's over, that sort of thing. But my message to everyone is not to give in to that. Not to give in to that impulse. And I can't put it any better than the words I saw a few years ago on a t-shirt. And the t-shirt said, failure to vote is not an act of rebellion, it's an act of surrender. I like that. Particularly when I talk with young people and students to say, look, you get a lot of stuff when you're 18 years old. Hopefully you will get a slice of birthday cake, a pat on the back, a gift or two. The other thing you get at age 18 in this country is formal political power. Formal political power. And you better use it. If you leave it on the table, if you give it up, if you surrender it, you are doing more harm than you know to yourself. To yourself. It is in your interest to use that power that you have. Don't surrender it. So I guess that's my message for the next 20 days, is for all of us to tell every person we know to stand up, to step up, and to be a voter. 20 days. 20 days. We'll see what happens. Thank you. In the time we have remaining, and give me the hook whenever, I know you have a business meeting to conduct after this, but okay, so I want to hear from you, including not just questions, but answers, and pushback, and feedback. And my tender feelings will not be hurt by criticism or suggestions about how to do things better or differently. So you go, and I'll just... Yeah. Great. Sir?
How long do you have to live at a particular address?
20 days.
For a technology purposes, can you just briefly summarize the question for the video?
Could we clarify
Yes.
that? Because he said at a particular address, and it's 20 days in Minnesota, but if you vote to a new address on election day, you can vote at that address.
That's correct. Yes, I assumed you meant Minnesota. Let me repeat the question. The question was, how long do you have to live here in order to vote in Minnesota? You have to be a resident of Minnesota for 20 days. But if you live in a particular place, and you had lived before in Minnesota, you can do it in fewer than that. And I'll give you a very personal example. My parents, in late October of an election year, moved from the house that I grew up in to a condo. They downsized. And they didn't even have a utility bill to show what their address was. So they did what Minnesota law, and we're one of the few states to do this, allowed them to do, which was have someone vouch for them. We have vouching in this state. So they found a neighbor, my dad found a neighbor, who could vouch and swear under penalty of perjury that he was who he says he was and lives where he says he lives. But he had to have moved, he had to have lived in this state. Had my parents moved from Kentucky, let's say, in late October, no go. But since they moved within Minnesota and were there within about 20 days, they could do it. So that's the answer. What else? Yes?
What about this photo ID problem? Is there any move in Minnesota to push for that?
So the question was about the photo ID proposal. You may all remember that in 2012 in the state, we had a big argument about that. I remember being in Alice Hausman's living room during one organizing session, which she graciously hosted, to try to fight that amendment, and we ended up doing that successfully, thanks to many people, Alice included, fighting that amendment. In 2012, the people of Minnesota rejected that proposed change to our Constitution, which would have required a government-issued photo ID. But to your question, are we seeing much of that? No. There seems to have been in Minnesota for now a truce on the voter ID wars, but other things have taken its place in terms of policy proposals, which in my view would have the effect of shutting out tens of thousands, if not more, eligible voters in Minnesota. But in terms of photo ID, no, all has been pretty quiet since the 2012 defeat, I would say. Yes?
Voter suppression is going on in a number of states and very visibly going on. And I don't understand why nobody can stop it.
So the question or the comment was about voter suppression, particularly in other states. You know, we have laws in this state that make voter suppression hard. That's not to say it doesn't happen, there aren't attempts, but it's much harder to do in Minnesota. But you take the state of Georgia right now, where the Secretary of State is running for governor right now. He's running for governor, and he just kicked off the rolls about 53,000 people in Georgia because they have what they call an exact match system. So if you miss a hyphen, or someone puts Robert instead of Bob, or a human being adds or subtracts a letter when they key in the address, or there's an extra space, if it's not an exact match, you are considered kicked off, among other reasons. 53,000 people, a huge percentage of them, over 70%, are people of color. And the Secretary of State is running for governor right now in a very, very close race where he's polling more or less evenly with his opponent. That is really disturbing. There is a lawsuit underway as of last week. Several parties and organizations have sued him and sued the Office of Secretary of State, so we'll see if they can get some relief there. But that's a very prominent, newsworthy example of something that, no question about it, will suppress the vote, especially since they don't have same-day voter registration like we do. So if you're not on the list, you can't vote. You can't just show up on election day and say, well, I'm going to re-register. It's trouble. It really is.
The Supreme Court a while back gutted the regional restrictions on the Voting Rights Act. Is there any chance that states could take that back to the Supreme Court, pointing out that every state that got released from the federal approval rule has gone hell-bent for voter suppression ever since? I mean, you know,
so let me repeat the question. The question was about, in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court came down with its Shelby County decision, which had the effect of pretty much gutting a section of the Voting Rights Act that called for pre-clearance. Under the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which I discussed at the beginning, there was a pre-clearance requirement for certain states in this country that had a demonstrated record of voter suppression and bad practices, where if they wanted to do election-related changes, they had to get pre-cleared through the Justice Department, even moving a polling place in those states. Well, the Supreme Court, in essence, said that that was stale and old, and there was no longer any need for that, in essence. And as a result, guess what happened? The ink was barely dry on the Shelby County decision before the very same states who were covered under pre-clearance did, guess what? Now they were unleashed and free to do what they wanted without having folks at the Justice Department look over their shoulder, and they took advantage of that. So they passed all sorts of restrictive, and I would say even mean, just plain mean voting laws. Polling place consolidation, really harsh and restrictive photo ID laws, and all sorts of things. So your question was, is it possible that that case could somehow make its way up again to the U.S. Supreme Court with a different result? Based on the idea that, no, you have a record now of what happens, and part of the case relied on an implied absence of any problems. The idea that, you know, hey, we don't really need this anymore, or it's outdated, or it's not supported by the fact. I suppose it's possible. I think it would be a very, very long time, and I think it would be very tough to do, to wind its way through the courts that way. I mean, I suppose Congress, if you had the right Congress, could take action and amend the Voting Rights Act to do the right thing and impose some reasonable review process for that state, for those states, and maybe other states, before they wittingly or unwittingly disenfranchise people.
My personal favorite right now, for an example, is Alabama, which passed a voter ID law and then started closing offices where you could get voter IDs in places where there weren't black people.
That's right. That's exactly right. Go ahead.
I have two questions. The first one maybe you can address later for a second. The first one is about whether or not the Secretary of State's office has any ability to do anything about redistricting. The second question is a little bit more minutiae. I know you deal with a lot of sort of bigger issues as the Secretary of State, but in Indivisible So, for instance, the application for ballot, and then have people fill those out.
Yeah.
There have been a couple issues that have come up with that, and I'm hopeful that by the 2020 election, we can get those fixed.
Okay.
They have to do mostly with the questions about ID, and in the voter application for an absentee ballot, it asks you to mark all that correspond.
Right.
And you're supposed to mark all of them that are true. When I called the Secretary of State's office, they said, well, they only need one of those forms of ID. So that's what we've been doing. But the paper is actually quite deceptive. It looks like you have to have all of those forms of ID, which really trips us up. So there's that problem. And then also with the voter registration form, when you fill that out, you're asked to mark one box and provide the number that applies to you. And the one that I've been telling people is to just fill in the last four of their social security number, because I'm pretty sure that works. But you're supposed to do one, either I have a Minnesota issued driver's
Right.
license, I do not have a resident driver's license, but the last four of my social are blank. And the fourth is I don't have a Minnesota issued driver's license or a social security number. So you're supposed to mark one of those boxes.
Right.
And if you just fill out the last four of your social, it makes it look like you're saying I don't have a Minnesota issued driver's license.
I see what you're saying. Yes.
So it's confusing, and for the sake of improving people's confidence in the process, a lot of people who are filling things out, they're like, I'm not really sure, is this really right? I'm not really sure if it's going to work. One of my members had someone who had printed out the application in Somali, maybe, and it said 2017, and they brought it to the Secretary of State's office, and they said, oh, this should work, even though it's like 2017, not 2018. So those kinds of things are little, they're not a big deal, but for those of us who are like working to get this stuff done, it's kind of a big deal. So I'm hopeful that next time
Yeah, thank you for those, and I'm happy to visit with you offline, or we can meet separately, or whatever. We're always looking for ways to
we
streamline.
call the Secretary of State's office.
Well, maybe
talk about it.
what we could do, and we should do, and will do, is why don't we have a meeting after the election?
Yeah.
And it's never too early to get going on 2020, and we can redo, it is possible to redo the form, and through word economy and cleaner, better language and more direct language, we have some leeway to change those words. Yeah, we don't want it to be misleading for people. So to your question about redistricting, we have a very small role in redistricting, not in the map making, not in the line drawing. We are the keeper of some of the maps. They have to be filed with our office, but that's really it. I have strong feelings on redistricting now, so I will hijack your question a little bit. I think and have thought for a while that Minnesota should go the way of Iowa, Arizona, California, go to an independent commission with legislative veto power. So the legislature is still in it, but it has worked very well in those states where, the bill that was proposed here in Minnesota that had bipartisan support, but not enough of it, would say that legislative Democrats would appoint 2 retired judges, legislative Republicans would appoint 2 retired judges, those 4 retired judges would get in a room and pick a 5th retired judge, and then those 5, plus staff, aiding them, of course, would draw out the maps. The legislature could vote it up or down. If it was down, it would go back to the drawing board for a second time. Legislature up and down. If it was down, then the legislature could draw the map. The problem is it always ends up in the courts anyway, and it ends up being kind of a waste of time in the legislature because the judges end up either partially or substantially redrawing the lines anyway. It ends up being sort of a partisan food fight, and it just makes sense and gives voters confidence. Others have said it many times, but ideally, I think, you want voters to choose their elected officials, not the other way around. And the problem with legislators drawing their own and congressional districts is it looks like a conflict. They get to draw their own districts. Yes. Go ahead. Yeah.
I first wanted to say that the Secretary of State website is really good. I mean, I think it's been really effective to just find a link and then pop it on Facebook without having to explain what you're showing. And the graphics tend to be really eye-catching. And I had to go to the website to find information like, what if you're homeless? Can you still vote? I mean, to be able to tell some people I work with, that, yeah, you can still vote, this is what we need to do. But as far as some ideas of what we can do about, I think Minnesota could say, yeah, 75% is good, but we're shooting for 100. And so that we are actually telling the rest of the country that we have some policies to go against voter suppression, and we're really looking for voter inspiration. And like I think in 2014, for example, Metro Transit offered free rides on election day. And I don't hear anything about doing that now, but yet we still offer free rides on St. Patrick's Day or State Fair or to the Twin Lands. So to me, it's just, we could just go more boldly for some of those things. And then also even consider having election day be a holiday. So just a combination of things telling the rest of the country we're not satisfied with 75, we're going for 100.
That was a great point. Let me just repeat. So the idea here, among other things that we could do, is really think outside of the box in terms of transportation options. Metro Transit has in the past, on occasion, provided rides. I will say, Uber and Lyft this time are providing free rides to the polling place. So that's a key thing as well. But you mentioned not being satisfied with 75%. Hey, let's shoot for 100%. So there are things we can do. That's just one example to experiment and to really inspire people to vote as well. Thank you. And thanks for the compliment on the website. We worked hard on the website. We spent over a year redoing the website, and not just, as they say, reskinning it. This wasn't just the cosmetic, the color scheme, and all of that. Yes, we did that, but we really changed the functionality of the website. We had focus groups of actual users, so we weren't just redoing a website to make it in the image that we thought was cool internally, but we did it in terms of our users, and we get a lot of users. We get over 1 million unique visitors a year to that website. Over 1 million a year, so that's a lot.
So I'm a walking advertisement for your website. I appreciate everything that you're doing. And I want to ask you about that meeting that we want to hold after the election. Because on the one hand, it's been so, I've been doing a lot of voter registration this year, and on the one hand, it's been so fantastic to see so many groups, so many people do voter registration. On the other hand, it's been a little bit frustrating because it wasn't coordinated by anybody. Like everybody was doing whatever they could, whenever they could. And like I've been in places where I was interacting with voters all the time, and other places where I was sitting for 2 hours doing nothing. And then there were like open streets where there were 5, 6 groups at the same time doing voter registration. So what is your office going to do to, if anything, to coordinate across all these?
Well, so the comment was about coordination primarily, and we have seen each other at some of the open streets events where there seems to be, you might go to a festival or like open streets, and there might be 5 groups with 5 separate booths doing voter registration. There might be League of Women Voters, and there might be Voto Latino, and there might be ACLU, and there might be others doing this work. And the question was, is anyone going to sort of organize that over one roof? It's hard to do in the sense that in some ways it's good to have some overlap and have different people targeting different segments and doing their own thing. It's sort of hard. We don't have any legal authority, obviously, to tell a private group to stop doing something that they want to do. But we like to think of ourselves as a one-stop shop for at least the resources and the information. And our model of nonpartisan voter outreach has been to not do it ourselves, but to rely on partners. So the old model would have said that we would have a table at 400 festivals around the Office of Secretary of State around the state. We don't do that because you and your organizations know that work better. We can provide you with the materials, we can provide you with resources, answers, etc., so that you can do it, particularly if you have a relationship with a particular community. That's better than us at the Office of Secretary of State going to hundreds of festivals or parades or what have you. And so it's hard to say. It's hard to compel or force organizations to sort of get on the same page, especially when they all have the same goal, I suppose. They might have their own reasons for wanting their own separate table. and that is to maybe also register people to vote, but pitch their own group's agenda or views, and so it's hard to totally streamline and centralize that, I would think. Yes?
To add to the list for the meeting after the election is the absentee ballot and the witness signature for the ballot. As somebody who might be a shut-in, who might put the mail in the mail slot for the mailman to pick up. And I think it's kind of like that no excuse, or that excuse balloting. I think it's kind of lame. I see the legalese might be behind it, but I think something different should be done, especially if somebody's registered already.
Very interesting. Okay, the comment here was when you vote by absentee, particularly when you're at home doing it, you need a witness signature, not signing your ballot, so they're not, but signing the envelope, the sealed envelope. And I guess what you're suggesting is, should we revisit that? Do we even need that? Is that another barrier if someone lives alone and maybe can't find someone around them that, do we need that anymore? I mean, that's something we can always discuss.
So kudos also on the website. I love when I'm registering voters to be able to help them pull down their sample ballot. That's awesome. Kudos also on the resources in your office. So I was compiling a voter guide for judges, and it's very difficult, even from the county office, to get good information about judges, even the process of how they're on the ballot. But someone in your office was extremely helpful and extremely responsive, so I just wanted to acknowledge you.
Thank you.
And I'm a new judge for the first time at the primary, and some of the things you said today I thought were extremely relevant and important. So I'm wondering if on your website you could even have information for judges. I mean, like, these are the languages that were used in 1860, and there's the languages now and the percentages. Because when people are standing in line, I think there'd be some ways to kind of engage them and excite them about voting, and having some of those facts handy might be a way to create a little bit more enthusiasm in the polling place.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you for that. Yes?
The website says, can you do the sample ballot? You try and print it out, it's longer than 11.5 by 8.
Oh, really?
So it gets all skewed, the second page, follow judges, got all skewed and didn't print out right. So
The comment was about the sample ballot that you can call off by typing in your address, and how the material on your printer is longer, or on your page is longer than can accommodate a piece of it. That might be a printer setting issue, but we can talk about that later. But
the ballots really are that big. It's an
yes,
image.
they are.
It's an image of the real thing.
Yes.
If you print it 80%, it'll all come on the page.
Yes, exactly. If you print it at 80%, it'll all come on the page. There are ways you can do that with your printer settings. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
So you had mentioned about possibly changing the name from absentee ballot to
Right.
like vote at home. Is that something the Secretary of State can do, or is that an active?
Oh, no.
Lawmakers have to do that, or?
No, the question was, I had mentioned that I prefer the term vote from home or vote at home to no excuses, absentee voting. No, that's just sort of a marketing thing. So I'm trying to refer to it more as that. Even the word absentee, it came about in the first place because you had to be absent to have an absentee ballot. It doesn't make sense because you don't have to be absent anymore. So
But it still says that on
it does say that,
yeah.
You're right. Well, that part of it, you're right about that. That part would take an act of the legislature to change
Okay.
the very language. But I can market it and talk about it any way I want.
Yeah,
But what is
okay.
written on the ballot, you're right, that is dictated by statute. Yes?
I have two questions. First one is, I actually took my absentee ballot today. I'm in Ramsey County, so I went to the Ramsey County office. And the lady said, so I wasn't in your office. So the lady said the reason for the signature was not to sign the outside of the enclosed, the ballot after it's been enclosed and sealed. But she said it was the reason for the signature of someone else is so that you show them the ballot before you marked it, so they can just attest that the ballot that they received was unmarked and not a pre-marked ballot. Is she right, or is it? What's the reason for it?
I would say this, it's complicated. Yes, the whole signature requirement. And actually, there are other ways in which we've moved away from signatures to barcodes or other things like that that are a little bit more reliable and that sort of thing. So I think revisiting that general issue of how you, I don't want to say prove, but how you provide some support or guarantee that the person who was supposed to vote this ballot really voted the ballot. I mean, there are ways, we should talk about it after the election. It's come up from time to time. This isn't a new debate.
And my second question is, how are you reaching out to the Native American community?
Yes. Reaching out to the Native American communities. Yeah, so I've visited a number of the reservations and talked to other Native American leaders. The reservations have some challenges. One of the things that has been frustrating too, and I don't want to lump every community together, but I will say in a couple instances, one thing that has been frustrating is a law that we have on the books in Minnesota that says if you're going to have an early voting station at a city hall or a county government, it's got to be in that one location the entire 46 days of the absentee. You can't move it around. And what they would prefer to do, and it's not this issue is not just limited to reservations. In fact, in Minneapolis and St. Paul and other places, they've brought up the same issue. But I'm hearing it on reservations, which is, why can't you have a mobile station that moves from one part of the reservation to another? Or in St. Paul, hey, we're going to be in Frogtown the week of such and such, and then we're going to go over and move into Crocus Hill on such and such, and another neighborhood. And, why can't you move? Why must it be fixed in one place for 46 days? Can't you move it around? That's something that in some Native American communities and reservation communities that they've been particularly attuned to. So I'm really interested in exploring that in particular.
And I was interested particularly in this group who are getting some mobile trailers pretty soon, living in tents. What is your outreach to them?
To who? I'm sorry?
The people in Minneapolis who are in tents now, but do you
Yes.
want to look for
So
mobile homes?
in essence, your question is, what about the homeless?
Yeah.
In Minnesota, we thankfully have strong laws that enable people who are homeless to vote. Because of vouching that we have, we're one of only 8 or 9 states that have vouching. You can register to vote either if you're being sheltered, you can register to vote from that address, or if you're not even technically at a fixed address, like the people in the tent encampment in Minneapolis, you can vote giving that as your actual address if you have someone vouch for you, that that's where you've resided, that's where you are right now, everything we do to have people vouch. So we, luckily, have really good laws in place so those who are voters experiencing homelessness can vote.
Really simple question. On Facebook, there's these rumors that you use stamps, don't use stamps, you need like 5 stamps. Do you use stamps to vote?
Yes.
Okay. Do you need 1 stamp?
Yes, you need 1 stamp.
Thank you.
That's it. Sir?
Back to your comment about the omnibus bill, we were being partisan, which I think we're in at this point. Who would we lay the blame to for putting that in the omnibus bill?
Well,
That would be vetoed?
I'm trying to be charitable here.
We'll try.
The question was, if you were to view this in a partisan lens, and I talked about what happened at the legislature this session when it came to the federal money that we needed legislative approval for, who would bear most of the blame? Well, I mean, the legislature is in Republican hands, but I want to be fair there too, which is one chamber was better than the other. So even though both are in Republican hands, I have to give credit where it's due, and that is that the House didn't have a problem with this and would have been happy to have it travel on its own as a vehicle or put it on something that was going to cut across the finish line. Same party, different chamber. The Senate leadership, unfortunately, was very different. So that was a disappointment. So I would say, technically the answer to your question is, Republicans run both chambers of the legislature right now, but one was acting, I think, reasonably, the other unreasonably.
So if we have a serious penetration of the voting system, we can blame them.
I don't even want to.
And as someone once said, who's going to jail?
Yeah, right. Look, I mean, it's entirely dependent on what kind of breach we would have, where it came, how it came, whatever. I feel very good about where we are. I hope not to ever have to answer that question for real, because I hope everything goes well on Election Day. I have every reason to believe it will, but you just never know. But I feel quite strong and confident about where we are in terms of the security of our system right now. But as I said, it is a race without a finish line. And we have to keep staying ahead of the bad guys every step of the way. Let me just say one last thing before I get yanked from the stage for the business meeting, which is this. I know that not everyone in a room like this feels comfortable raising their hand, or maybe we ran out of time, or maybe you don't think of something that you want to say or ask or push back on until tomorrow or next week or next month. So if any of those things happen, I really hope you'll reach out to me. My email address is the same as most state employees, the same convention. It's just steve.simon@state.mn.us. You can Google it. It's out there. There is no filter, gatekeeper, watcher, whatever. That goes right to me. And I'm happy to have the give and take. If you say, yeah, I was there at the library that day and I didn't get a chance to ask this, or I was at the library that day and 6 weeks later I thought of this, and you ought to do this differently, or why didn't you think of that, or whatever. I really like that. And so I hope you'll take me up on it, and I thank you very, very much for giving up some of your time.